All right, so there's our boy Hobbes. There's the frontispiece of Leviathan, which is the book from which there was an excerpt in the reading today. And that big guy with the sword and the scepter is the sovereign. And according to Hobbes, in order to escape the state of nature, in order to get out of this situation where nobody can reasonably trust anybody, and everybody knows that nobody can reasonably trust anybody, and everyone is constantly in fear for their lives and constantly trying to bully each other in order to gain some reputation so that if someone is going to fuck with someone, it's not going to be me that they fuck with. It's best to establish some sort of state of civilization, and that's going to require absolute monarchy. How exactly we get to absolute monarchy takes a few steps. We'll see some of those steps today. But the conclusion that Hobbes draws in the Leviathan is that it's so bad to be in a state of nature that literally any kind of political order and structure and stability is preferable to the state of nature. And therefore, even though it's not nice to be under someone's thumb, it's better to be under someone's thumb than to be in a state of nature. And the only circumstances in which it is rational or reasonable to oppose the sovereign is in the case where the sovereign is literally trying to get you killed right now. That's a very extreme version of the social contract view. We're going to see a whole bunch of alternative versions of the social contract view, but all of them have the same background structure, which is to say that you should only do the sort of thing that someone would do if they were abiding by rules that no one could reasonably object to. So, how do we get there? Well, Hobbes starts out saying that nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can thereupon claim himself any benefit to which another may not pretend as well. So he's saying, yeah, people are different. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are stronger than others. But we're all the same species. We're not that different from each other. And so the people who are maybe a little bit more clever, the people who are maybe a little bit stronger or faster, they're not really in a position to claim anything other than what those who are less clever and less strong can claim. And why is that? For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest. So you can sneak up on someone in their sleep and put a knife in their heart, either by secret machination like that, or, and this is really important, by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. So maybe there's some guy who's like really tough, big guy, strong, never sleeps for some reason. Even still, if like 12 of us team up against him, he's toast, right? So who does he think he is? And actually, anthropologists will tell you that this kind of thing happens in human society going back basically since we know about it. Small band hunter-gatherer societies, when they have a chief who becomes too bossy, will either kill him or they all just get up in the middle of the night and leave, and then he's on his own. That's a pretty standard practice. So if you've got a bully, there's a very strong human inclination to either kill the bully or abandon the bully, which, given human fragility, living literally on your own with no support from others is essentially a death sentence. So what Hobbes is saying here is like, we need to take into account the fact that while there are differences between people, we're similar enough to each other that we all have, in some sense, an equal claim to the benefits of society. So we're not so different, you and I. Okay, he goes on. And again, I realize that the language here can be a little bit challenging. From this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. So he's saying, look, everybody can sneak up on and kill anybody else, and even if they can't sneak up, they can create a coalition and handle it that way. So in the end, we should all make equal claims of each other. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, so he's talking about goods that are finite and that can be used up, he says they become enemies. And in the way to their end, the thing that they're pursuing, which is principally their own conservation, so they want to stay alive, and sometimes their delectation, their enjoyment as well, they endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. And from hence it comes to pass that where an invader hath no more to fear than another man's single power, if one plant, sow, build, or possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to come prepared with forces united to dispossess and deprive him not only of the fruits of his labor, but also of his life or his liberty. What is he saying here? He's saying, when you've got this situation where everybody can harm anybody else, it's kind of foolish to build up resources that another person can take from you. You're basically putting a target on your back, right? So if you accumulate things that can be stolen, then someone's going to be tempted to steal them. And since we're all so similar to each other, they might get away with it. Has anybody watched The Walking Dead? So this is a zombie show, and it's essentially a depiction of the state of nature. So in zombie shows and zombie movies, the zombies aren't really the problem. It's always other people that are the problem. Society is broken down. Nobody trusts anybody. Everybody knows that nobody trusts anybody. Everyone's desperate for resources. And if you've watched The Walking Dead, you know, like, every time they build up their camp to such an extent that they actually have a decent life and stuff that's worth having and stuff that might be worth taking, somebody comes along, some other group comes along and attacks them. This happens every season at least. That's the kind of thing that Hobbes is talking about here. He's saying when you accumulate movable resources, there will be someone who wants those resources. And given the way that the state of nature works, they'll probably come and try to take them. And so maybe it's just not worth even trying. This is why he thinks it's so good to get out of the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, what you've got is diffidence. Now, he's using this word in a way that we no longer use it. So nowadays, if you say that someone is diffident, you mean they're shy, they're easily bossed around, they take orders from others, right? That's not what Hobbes means here. He has something very specific in mind when he talks about diffidence. What he means by diffidence is not a disposition of a single individual person, but rather a state of society, namely one in which nobody trusts anybody, nobody has any reason to trust anybody, and everybody knows that that's how things are. So he says, from this diffidence of one another, there's no way for any man to secure himself so reasonably as anticipation. That is, by force or wiles to master the persons of all men he can, so long as he see no other power great enough to endanger him. And this is no more than his own conservation, his own will to live, to stay alive, is generally allowed. So he's saying in a state of nature where you know that as soon as you start building up any resources, people are going to come and try to take them from you by force, what you might reasonably do, and no one could reasonably object to you doing, is to engage in something like preemptive war. So by force or by wiles to master others before they do it to you. This doesn't sound very pleasant, right? This is not a good way to live. But he's saying like, look, you know that they're coming for you. What are you going to do? You going to sleep at night? No, you're going to come for them first, right? That's the only option. Remember, this is the guy who lived through the English Civil War. Right, so I got to The Walking Dead too early. Yeah, so basically, he's saying, you know, you need to be on your toes, and you need to be in a position where you're willing to take others down before they take you down, if you're in a state of nature. Okay, so what happens in this state of nature? Well, men have no pleasure, but on the contrary, a great deal of grief in keeping company where there is no power able to overawe them. In other words, this is where he moves to the sovereign, right? So he says, look, this is what the state of nature is like. People are going to be pillaging each other, attacking each other, enslaving each other. They're going to engage in preemptive war because they're worried that someone else is going to do that to them first. And this is no good. There's no pleasure in this. And in fact, there's a great deal of grief in this. So we need some power to tell people, like, look, knock it off, don't do that. So he goes on and he says, for every man looketh that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself. So now he's switched to reputation. And upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing, naturally endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his contemners, the people who have contempt for him, by damage, and from others by the example. So what he's saying here, and this is something that's been borne out empirically by researchers who've investigated so-called cultures of honor, is that if you find yourself in a state of nature, if you find yourself in this situation of diffidence where people don't trust each other and everyone knows that they don't trust each other, then it's good to have a reputation for retaliation. Because you don't want people fucking with you. And if you make it clear through retaliation that you're not the one that they should be fucking with, then other people won't, right? So he's talking here about what's sometimes called negative reciprocity, and in particular, negative reciprocity that's done in public. So positive reciprocity has to do with, like, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, right? And we know that people do this all the time. Non-human animals do this all the time. Positive reciprocity is nice. Negative reciprocity is not as nice. But it's very effective. So if someone hurts you, one thing you might do is hurt them back. And then you demonstrate to them, like, you better not do that again. And if you do it in public, then a bunch of other people see that, and they're like, oh, wow, I'm not going to mess with this one. Psychologists and sociologists have studied some of the differences between communities that have different subsistence strategies. So one common subsistence strategy is herding, another is farming. And one important difference between these is that if you're a herder, someone can steal your entire flock. They can just come and take it. It's movable. Whereas if you're a farmer, you've got, like, potatoes in the ground. Someone's not going to just, like, come in the night and take all of your potatoes and all of your land. What, they have, like, a dump truck or something? They take your soil? Like, it doesn't make sense to try to steal land in the same way that it makes sense to steal herds. Of course, you can steal land, but you can only do that by invading, which is a whole lot more effortful than coming and stealing someone's sheep in the night. Among communities that engage in subsistence herding, negative reciprocity, in particular violent reciprocity, is much more common than communities that engage in farming. And that's because you need more of a reputation for negative reciprocity when you're more vulnerable. That's the kind of thing that Hobbes is talking about here. So then he goes on and he summarizes the three main things that motivate people in a state of nature. So he says, in the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. Right? He's not happy about this. Right? First, competition. Right? So there are resources that are finite, and if I get some, then you don't get it, and so then we fight about it. The second is diffidence, so this lack of trust, which leads to preemptive war. And what he calls here glory, which is a reputation for negative reciprocity. The first maketh men invade for gain, right? So I move in and just take the resource. The second for safety, so that's the preemptive attack. And the third for reputation, which is also for safety in the end. So then he comes back to the sovereign, and he says, during the time men live without a common power to keep them all, in other words, when there's no sovereign, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. So if you watch like Game of Thrones, you think of war as like armies clashing, right? And dragons and stuff. But Hobbes's notion of war is different. He says that war is not battle or the act of fighting, but rather a period of time, a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So you can be at war without any shooting going on. And he goes on, he says, therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war. In such a condition, and this passage gives me chills when I read it. So I hope you'll give this one a good look. In such condition, there's no place for industry. He doesn't mean heavy industry like steel manufacturing. He means doing work that creates resources that can be stored and moved. In such condition, there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Somebody could just come and steal it. And consequently, no culture of the earth, so no agriculture, no navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea. Like, why are you going to try to import or export if somebody can just come along as a pirate and take your whole ship, right? No commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You're welcome. Okay, but this is an amazing passage, right? This is just like off the chain. He's saying, like, look how terrible the state of nature is. You have to want to get out of that. You don't want to live in the Walking Dead universe. It's not a good place to be. You don't want to live in a world where you're constantly fighting with people for scarce resources. You can't trust anybody. You feel like you need to engage in preemptive attacks on other humans that could go well, could go badly, and you've got to build up this reputation for being like a nasty motherfucker who will fuck you up if someone messes with you. Like, this is not a good way to live. Hobbes is really laying it on thick here. That's a picture from or a drawing from the English Civil War. Okay, so he says, the passions that incline men to peace are fear of death, desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and a hope by their industry to obtain them. And reason suggests convenient articles of peace, upon which men may be drawn to agreement. So he's saying, look, this is how bad the state of nature is. Continual fear of death, no arts, no letters, no society, no maps, no agriculture, no anything worth having, because someone's going to come and take it from you. So given how bad that is, we got to figure out how to come to some sort of arrangement where we don't do that to each other. And he proposes two fundamental laws of nature, as he calls them. They're not laws in the Newtonian sense, but they are laws in a moral sense because he thinks humans are rational enough to realize that the state of nature is really bad and that they will find a way to live with each other if they can, such that they escape the state of nature. So he says the right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturale, right of nature in Latin, is the liberty of each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. In other words, the right of self-defense. That is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in his own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. So he's saying the first thing that everybody is going to agree to is if someone's trying to kill you, you have a right to defend yourself. It's pretty hard to disagree with that. How are you going to convince someone like, yeah, I'm going to kill you now, and also you can't fight back? It would be unreasonable for you to fight back. I mean, maybe in a certain version of Christianity you see something like that. Even there, it's not clear. Maybe in a certain version of Buddhism you see something resembling that, but it's like, again, not even clear there. So this is something that's kind of a human universal. Then he goes on to say, he says, from this fundamental law of nature, the right of self-defense by which men are commanded to endeavor peace, is to derive the second law, namely, that a man be willing when others are so too, so conditionally, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So this is similar to like the golden rule, or the silver rule. It's a little bit similar to the categorical imperative, but it's different in an important way because it's conditional. Right? The categorical imperative is categorical. This is not. What Hobbes is suggesting here as this second law is a conditional willingness to not engage in warfare, not engage in preemptive attacks, not engage in violent negative reciprocity, just so long as the people you're dealing with also refrain from these things. So it's a conditional duty that if enough of us get together and agree to it, we can create something like a society. So he says the mutual transferring of right is that which men call contract. Right? So this agreement that we come to, we say, all right, I'm not going to go to war with you. I'm not going to steal your stuff. I'm not going to try to kill and enslave you. I'm not going to engage in preemptive attack. If you hurt me, I'm not going to engage in violent negative reciprocity, just so long as you're willing to do the same. Right? So if we make that kind of agreement, that's what he has in mind by a contract. And so that's why this view is called social contract theory. He goes on to say there's different kinds of contracts. So signs of contract are either express or by inference. Express contracts are ones that are where words are spoken with understanding of what they signify. So that would be like, we both say, I'm not going to engage in violent negative reciprocity. We shake hands, we look each other in the eye, we pinky swear, whatever it is. That's an express contract. It can be spoken, can be written. You could put it on a blockchain if you want. There's no reason to do that. We can go into that at some other point. He goes on to say, such words are either of the time present or past, as I give, I grant, I have given, I have granted, I will that this be yours, or of the future, as I will give, I will grant, which words of the future are called promise. So two different kinds of contract. One is sort of an acknowledgement contract, where you say like, yeah, we have come to this agreement. Another is a contract about future conduct, where you say, okay, this is how I'm going to act in the future. And then he says, yeah, but that's not the only kind of contract that there is. The other is more implicit, so signs by inference are sometimes the consequence of words, sometimes the consequence of silence, sometimes the consequence of actions, sometimes the consequence of forbearing an action. And generally a sign by inference of any contract is whatsoever sufficiently argues the will of the contractor. So if you think like when you're merging into traffic, so someone might like move their car in such a way that they make it clear that they're going to let you in, or they're not, right? So that for Hobbes is also a contract, right? So it doesn't have to involve words. It could involve action. It could involve inaction, and so on. And if someone sort of goes along with something long enough, and it's clear that they know that they're going along with it, then that's typically treated as a kind of implicit agreement or implicit contract. Now, that gets tricky, right? So if you think about things like sexual consent, without affirmative consent, you might wonder, like, is this something that my partner is agreeing to, or are they just like putting up with it, or are they scared? What is their state of mind? So these contracts by inference are very fraught, but they're also very common, not just in sex, but also in lots of human activity. And so it's something that needs a lot of thought and a lot of nuance. Okay, so that's Hobbes, and he kind of kicked off this social contract discussion. It's actually in Plato as well, in Protagoras? I forgot which dialogue, actually. It's in Plato, but it was sort of resurrected by Hobbes, and that triggered a bunch of other people to also think and write about social contracts. So the dude you're seeing here is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a Swiss philosopher who abandoned his child and mooched off of David Hume, and famously had a public falling out with David Hume, where he wrote a letter that he published like to the world saying, you know, Hume is an asshole. Very strange. Rousseau has a different version of the social contract view. He actually thinks the state of nature is more like the state of Eden, and that civilization was a mistake. In particular, he thinks civilization is a mistake for some of the same reasons that Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is dangerous. Namely, the accumulation of resources that can be stolen. So Rousseau in particular writes about the emotion of envy. And he thinks that once you have civilization, once you escape the state of nature, you're going to end up with inequality. Some people will have more than others. That's going to lead to envy. That's going to lead to violence. So for him, the best thing to do is to have equality, and the only way to do that is to go back to a state of nature. So almost the opposite of Hobbes. Kant has a view on the social contract. Locke, John Locke, pictured on the right, also has a view on the social contract. And he in particular has a view which involves mixing your labor with the land. So according to Locke, ownership is something you get by mixing your labor with something. So if you just sort of walk around and take some apples off a tree, but you didn't plant the tree, and you didn't water the tree, and you didn't fertilize the tree, and you didn't make sure that when the tree was attacked by insects, that the insects were taken away, then you don't own the tree, you're just exploiting the tree. which is fine, but it doesn't grant you ownership. By contrast, if you go and plant an orchard and you tend to it and you look after it and you protect it, then you're mixing your labor with that land, and that means that you own it. This theory was used during the Enlightenment colonial period as a justification for land theft in multiple continents. So the British were especially good at this. They would come along and say, look at these people, they're hunter-gatherers. They don't cultivate the earth. Right? So their subsistence strategy is not one that involves working the soil. Well, that means they don't own it because they didn't mix their labor with it. And that means we can take it. Because if there is a resource that no one has claimed, then you can own it simply by claiming it. You bring your flag along, you stick it in the ground, it's yours now. You start mixing your labor with it, it's even more clear that it's yours now. So the social contract view has problems as well. There's also nice versions of the social contract view. So this is John Rawls, American philosopher from the 20th century, arguably the most important or the second most important political philosopher of the 20th century. Rawls developed a version of the social contract view that was partially inspired by Hobbes, but which also used, to some extent, game theory, which is an approach to practical rationality developed by von Neumann and Morgenstern in the first half of the 20th century. Has anybody come across game theory a little bit? Yeah, we're going to do some later. The basic idea with game theory is in decision theory, all you're trying to do is find the option that will maximize your expected utility. So you could do A, you could do B, you could do C. If you do A, you have a 50% chance of making $10 and 50% chance of losing 5. If you do B, you have a 70% chance of making $20 and a 30% chance of losing 2. If you do C, I can't do all this math in my head, sorry, but you pick the one that gives you the highest expected utility. In game theory, things become more complicated, and that's because the expected utility of your action is not dependent solely on what you choose to do, but also on what at least one other person chooses to do. So a famous version, famous example of this is actually due to Rousseau. It's called the stag hunt. Has anybody come across the stag hunt? No? Okay. So Rousseau says, look, you could, if you and another person are living as hunter-gatherers, in particular as hunters, you could choose today to try to hunt a rabbit, and you're pretty good at hunting rabbits, so you're more or less guaranteed if you hunt a rabbit, you catch a rabbit. Or you could agree to hunt a stag, a deer, a kangaroo with them. I'm so culturally aware. Thing is, to actually successfully hunt a stag, you need to cooperate. So if I scare the stag down the trail, you are lying in wait and you kill it. And then we can share the meat. And that could fail in multiple ways. So if I fail to scare the deer, then you are lying in wait and nothing happens. Or if I scare the deer, but you've sort of lost focus and decided to go hunt rabbits instead, right? Then it just runs away. So in a stag hunt, the expected value of my action, hunting deer versus hunting rabbit, is conditional on the action that you choose. And it's only rational for me to go for the high-value target, the stag, when I'm certain that you're going to do your part. Also hunt stag. Now you might think this is an easy one to solve. You know, we just shake hands, pinky swear, and we're off to the races. And to some extent, that's correct. But when there's doubts about someone's competence, or when there's doubts about their focus, their concentration, how easily distracted they are, then the stag hunt is a risky thing to do. Because if you let me down, I'm starving tonight. I won't die. I can go one night without eating, but it's going to be unpleasant. And if you keep letting me down, then I will die. Right, so game theory is about not just what is rational from an individual point of view, but rational from the point of view of an individual who is engaged in what's called a strategic interaction, namely an interaction where the value of their action is conditional on the action that another person takes. And Rawls, in Theory of Justice, says, okay, imagine that there's different ways of distributing the resources in a society. We could have a really unequal distribution, like in the United States. We could have a more equal distribution, like in Denmark. We could have, you know, any range of distributions of resources. And these will differ in two important ways. One is just the total amount of resource in the society. So it might be that, like, societies that have some inequality also just produce more overall value than societies that have more equal distributions. If you think that there's something to Rousseau's argument about envy, then that's probably right. Because once you have some inequality, then people get motivated to climb the ladder. And if you have equality, then people are like less motivated by envy and therefore produce less. But there's also this question of like, well, how much inequality are we willing to put up with? And Rawls says, well, imagine like a genetic lottery, or not even a genetic lottery. Imagine like a social lottery where you don't know in advance what family you're going to be born into. You don't know in advance how smart you're going to be. You don't know in advance how beautiful you're going to be. You don't know in advance how strong and tall you're going to be. So you could end up any sort of person. From behind this veil of ignorance, where you don't know what kind of person you're going to turn out to be, what kind of distribution of resources would you want in the society that you're going to be born into? Equal. You said equal. And why is that?
Oh, no. Because then regardless of your strength or privilege or whatever you have, you know that you'll have the same base level as everyone else, and you won't require killing your neighbor to survive, which will be cool.
Good. This is actually what Rawls says. So you don't need to read Theory of Justice. Actually, it's worth a read. Yeah, so this is actually what Rawls argues, and he tries to argue this on game theoretic grounds, using the von Neumann and Morgenstern axioms, which build in risk aversion. So risk aversion is disposition to choose options that have as their potential outcomes, the worst potential outcome is not as bad as any other worst potential outcome of some other action. Sorry, that didn't come out very clearly. So think of it this way. We could play a game where we flip a coin, and if it comes out heads, you get $10. If it comes out tails, you lose $10. Or we could play a game where we flip a coin, and then regardless of the outcome, you get nothing. Those have the same expected utility, 0. But one of them has a potential outcome that is worse than the other. It's also the one that has a potential outcome that's better than the other. So if you're risk averse, then you go for the second one. You say, look, I'm just not going to flip the coin, or we flip the coin and it doesn't matter what the outcome is. If you're risk seeking, then you'll go for the first option. You say, you know what? Let's play. Because I get a chance, at least, of a $10 payoff. And I'm willing to take the risk of the $10 loss to have that chance of the $10 payoff. That's a principle from von Neumann and Morgenstern's decision theory, which they also build into their game theory. And Rawls suggests that if you are making a decision about the distribution of resources in a society, you should also be risk averse. He considers it axiomatic, which is an obvious truth. And that given that that's what a reasonable person would choose, that's actually how we should organize our society. So he says that the policies of a state should be designed to benefit the least well-off members of that society. So it's a risk-averse policy. So lots of different versions of social contract theory. We just saw 6 of them, I think. All of them are based on some notion of a legitimate contract, an agreement, which can be implicit or explicit. And the basic idea here is that a contract is only legitimate when all parties to that contract are, in some sense, free, in some sense, equal, and in some sense, rational. Now, of course, these are a bunch of big words with some gnarly concepts. So, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be equal? What does it mean to be rational? For Rawls, the idea of the veil of ignorance is meant to implement this notion of freedom, equality, and rationality, because when you're behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know where you're going to end up in society. You might end up on the top. You might end up in the middle. You might end up at the bottom. So you're not already in a position of power. So in that sense, you're just as free as everyone else. He also points out that everyone is meant to be reasoning as if they're behind the veil of ignorance. That makes them equal. And he also says they abide by the von Neumann and Morgenstern principles of game theory, which are ideally rational in a sense. Got a hand up? Can you hand this back?
So in this case, ignorance isn't necessarily ignorance, but lack of bias, rather?
So ignorance is lack of knowledge, and what you're ignorant of in the Rawls situation is your
The
own
outcome.
place in the society.
Okay, but in a more general sense, it would be the outcome of your gamble, whatever is made.
Yeah, so you don't know whether you're a Rothschild or an orphan.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
I was also wondering, so you didn't specify whether you were talking about, are we applying the social contract theory to people within the society or societies when forming some sort of social contract between each other? Because it doesn't matter, or from what I can see, it doesn't really matter what contract you have in place, there'll still be some sort of war taking place, just on a larger scale, because we still have wars between countries. It's just people aren't fighting each other for supplies now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in fact, I think it's my next slide. Yeah. So this is American philosopher Charles Mills. He died, last year, 2 years ago. He wrote a book called The Racial Contract, where he argues that we shouldn't just be thinking about the contract within a community, but also about the international context, because what has historically happened is Europeans and their descendants made a contract amongst themselves to pillage the rest of the world. And if you look at maps, you can see this very clearly, right? All those straight lines, those aren't rivers, right? Somebody sat down, a few people sat down in a room and said, yep, that's ours, that's yours, right? And they just agreed to go and take land from people in Africa, North America, South America, Asia, and Australia. And so when we're thinking about the distribution of resources, we shouldn't, according to Charles Mills, think just about the distribution within a community or society, but also the distribution as it's negotiated or as it turns out internationally. Let's take a 10-minute break.